tense standoff ensues during the year of 856 in the ancient Kingdom of Wessex. As reported by Asser, civil war almost ignited, caused in part by the memory of one woman, a woman long dead and who had fallen around half a century before from the heights of power into squalid ignominy. In 856, the aging father of King Alfred the Great had returned from his pilgrimage to Rome with the child Alfred in tow, yet though warmly welcomed by many, a conspiracy had festered while Ethelwulf had lingered in West Francia. Asser relates much of what we shall hear today, so before we delve into events, who was our source? Asser was a Welsh monk and scholar who wrote the life of King Alfred, a contemporary and valuable source on the life of this great monarch. Asser wrote the work in 893, years after his patron's triumph over Guthrum at Edington and his rise to the status of King of the Anglo-Saxons. Asser was asked by Alfred to join his circle of scholars and advisors around the mid-880s and eventually rose to become the Bishop of Sherborne around the middle 890s. Though an important source on this period, experts tend to be cautious with some elements of the work, considering it is obviously very pro-Alfredian in nature. With this in mind, why was Wessex on the verge of civil war, and why was it partially the memory of one reckless and debauched queen that provoked this? Well, a year before, the King of Wessex, Ethelwulf, had made the unusual decision of leaving his kingdom to go on pilgrimage to Rome. 2 years before, his youngest son, the future Alfred the Great, had made his own journey there at the tender age of around 4 or 5. Incidentally, Asser's description of Alfred being anointed as king at this time is a good example of why Asser's life, while valuable, should be handled carefully. Such a ceremony did happen, and Alfred may even have half remembered the event as such and related as much to Asser much later on. However, a letter from Pope Leo himself, the man who performed the ceremony, explains Alfred's ceremony in the following way, quote, "We have now graciously received your son Alfred, whom you were anxious to send at this time to the threshold of the Holy Apostles, and we have decorated him as a spiritual son with the dignity of the belt and vestments of the consulate, as is customary with Roman consuls, because he gave himself into our hands." Ethelwulf himself had to prepare the ground a little for his own journey. A king in such troubled times could not simply up and leave without settling matters. Part of this involved ensuring rule remained with him and his family while he was gone. Luckily, Ethelwulf had 2 adult sons, Ethelbald and Ethelbert. The former was given Wessex to rule, while the latter was installed as King of Kent, which included the Eastern Territories. With matters set, Ethelwulf set off for a successful visit to the Eternal City, his youngest, Alfred, accompanying him. On his return journey, however, there was to be another important event, the marriage of the aging Ethelwulf to Judith, the teenage daughter of Charles the Bald, himself the powerful King of West Francia, and the grandson of Charlemagne himself. The two were wed on 1st of October 856 at the royal palace of Eadburh, and significantly too, Judith was crowned the Queen of Wessex. News must have spread fast back to Wessex, and when the so-called great and good of the kingdom learned they had a new queen, more than a few eyebrows must have been raised. On Ethelwulf's return to Wessex, the reception was mixed according to Asser, and here we can now delve into why, directly from the horse's mouth. Quote, "King Ethelbald and Aelstan, Bishop of Sherborne, along with Eanwulf, Ealdorman of Somerset, are reported to have plotted that King Ethelwulf should never again be received in the kingdom on his return from Rome. A great many people ascribe this wretched incident to the bishop and the ealdorman alone. There are also many who attribute it solely to arrogance on the part of King Ethelbald. The conspiracy is further related to have been centred west of Selwood, a reference to the rival domains of the bishops of Sherborne and Winchester respectively, Sherborne's west and Winchester's to the east. According to Asser, by no means all of the nobility were on board with Ethelbald's faction. However, it was Ethelwulf himself that prevented a war between father and son. A compromise was reached whereby Ethelwulf would rule over the eastern districts, with Ethelbald retaining direct rule of the western districts. Just exactly what Asser means here with these terms is arguable. Did Ethelbert, who had remained loyal to his father, remain King of Kent, and Ethelwulf rule east of Selwood, but not east as in Kent? Or did he take rule over from Ethelbert, leaving the entirety of Wessex to his grasping son? Whatever the case, Ethelwulf retained some form of rule. Given Asser's language in describing Ethelbald, it's clear he had ambitions outside any noble intent in preventing a West Saxon custom from being subverted. As a young man, already having tasted independent power for a short time, it may not be surprising that he made a bid to retain such independence. Ethelwulf was probably into his 60s by that point, a very old man for the age, and perhaps impatience got the best of his elder son. All of this is to stress that, at best, Judith's coronation as queen was a factor in the coup, and not the reason for it. That Judith was a direct scion of Charlemagne himself, and thus had the blood of the Carolingian kings in her veins, and could also, by extension, sire heirs that had the same blood, probably didn't comfort Ethelbald either. Back on the subject of Ethelwulf's marriage, interestingly, Asser writes, quote, "Without any disagreement or dissatisfaction on the part of his nobles, Ethelwulf ordered that Judith should sit beside him on the royal throne till the end of his life, though this was contrary to the wrongful custom of that people." Interesting? Well, yes, because if we indulge Asser here and assume he's not exaggerating, the custom of no queens allowed was, at least in this case, ignored by all the great men of the kingdom and disputed generally. Yet this still leaves us to wonder why such a custom even existed. Here Asser provides a detailed account, which we shall follow for a while going on. Here is the story of Eadburh. Quote, "The West Saxons did not allow the queen to sit beside the king, nor indeed did they allow her to be called queen, but rather king's wife. The elders of the land maintain that this disputed and indeed infamous custom originated on account of a certain grasping and wicked queen of the same people, who did everything she could against her lord and the whole people, so that not only did she earn hatred for herself, leading to her expulsion from the queen's throne, but she also brought the same foul stigma on all the queens who came after her. For as a result of her very great wickedness, all the inhabitants of the land swore that they would never permit any king to reign over them who during his lifetime invited the queen to sit beside him on the royal throne." And because many do not know, I suspect, how this perverse and detestable custom, contrary to the practice of all Germanic peoples, originally arose in the Saxon land, I think I should explain it a little more fully. I have heard the explanation from my lord, the truthful Alfred, King of the Anglo-Saxons, who still often tells me about it, and he had likewise heard it from many reliable sources, indeed to a large extent from men who remembered the event in all its particulars. There was in Mercia in fairly recent times a certain vigorous king called Offa, who terrified all the neighbouring kings and provinces around him, and who had a great dyke built between Wales and Mercia from sea to sea. Beorhtric, king of the West Saxons, received in marriage his daughter, called Eadburh. As soon as she had won the king's friendship and power throughout almost the entire kingdom, she began to behave like a tyrant after the manner of her father, to loathe every man whom Beorhtric liked, to do all things hateful to God and men, to denounce all those whom she could before the king, and thus by trickery to deprive them of either life or power. And if she could not achieve that end with the king's compliance, she killed them with poison. This is known to have happened with a certain young man very dear to the king, whom she poisoned when she could not denounce him before the king. King Beorhtric himself is said to have taken some of that poison unawares. She had intended to give it not to him, but to the young man, but the king took it first, and both of them died as a result. Accordingly, when King Beorhtric was dead, since Eadburh was unable to stay any longer among the Saxons, she sailed overseas with countless treasures and went to Charlemagne, the very famous king of the Franks. As she stood before the throne bearing many gifts for the king, Charlemagne said to her, "Choose, Eadburh, whom you wish between me and my son, who is standing with me on this throne." She, foolishly replying without thinking, said, "If the choice is left to me, I choose your son, as he is younger than you." Charlemagne smiled and replied to her, "Had you chosen me, you would have had my son, but because you have chosen my son, you will have neither him nor me." He did, however, give her a large convent of nuns, in which, having put aside the clothing of the secular world and taken up that of nuns, she discharged the office of abbess, but only for a few years. For just as she is said to have lived recklessly in her own country, so was she seen to live still more recklessly among a foreign people. When at long last she was publicly caught in debauchery with a man of her own race, she was ejected on Charlemagne's orders, and shamefully spent her life in poverty and misery until her death. So much so that in the end, accompanied by a single slave boy, as I have heard from many who saw her, and begging every day, she died a miserable death in Pavia. So there we have it, the story of Eadburh. But how much of this is reliable? It's worth saying firstly that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle does little more than simply record the death of Beorhtric in 802, and then the succession of his former rival Egbert. Egbert was, of course, King Alfred's grandfather and the founder of his own house, who rather vaguely traced their descent from him back to a brother of a distant King of Wessex. Egbert's own father may have been Aelmund, the briefly reigning King of Kent, who was locally driven from Kent by Offa. Indeed, his son Egbert would share this fate of exile, himself being driven from Wessex in 786 after he unsuccessfully contested the succession with Beorhtric. Given this rivalry for the throne, it's hard to ignore the obvious incentive for both Alfred and thus Assa to exaggerate or even make up the story of Eadburh's tyranny. I personally think this is unlikely. Beorhtric was clearly a close ally, verging on a puppet of Offa, the much more powerful monarch. The very marriage itself may have been a way of binding the West Saxon monarch closer to the Mercian king. Offa himself, as well as driving Aelmund from Kent, could also have supported Beorhtric directly in his takeover of 786. Binding him closer with this marriage makes sense, apart from Assa's account. With this heavy association with a great enemy of Alfred's house, and with a natural need to emphasise the family's own legitimacy to rule Wessex, we can see why Assa would paint such a terrible portrait of Eadburh. The truth, as with many things, is likely somewhere in between. Perhaps Eadburh was simply a forceful personality and not shy in expressing this as queen. Given the context of the geopolitics of the time, it's not hard to believe such a queen would have been more influential than usual too, given who her father was. This, of course, is merely speculation on my part. What do you think about Assa's grasping queen? Do you fully believe Assa's account, or are Assa's words hiding the true nature of this powerful Queen of Wessex? Tell us in the comments, and I'll see you next time.